It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Daniel Harris, a retired U.S. Army sergeant, wheeled himself into his favorite small-town coffee shop. On his chest, neatly polished and carefully placed, were his service medals, including one that caught the light just right, making it impossible not to notice. Most people offered him a warm smile or a respectful nod. But not today. Today, a young employee behind the counter snickered as Daniel rolled up. Loud enough for the people in line to hear, he muttered, "Man, what's the point of all those shiny pins if you're just sitting in a chair now?" The words cut through the air, sharp and disrespectful. A few customers glanced away awkwardly. Others froze. Daniel didn't say a word at first. He just looked up at the young man, his eyes calm, steady, and filled with a weight that silence can carry better than any outburst. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Take a second to drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from right now. This is more than just a story. It's a lesson. And by sharing where you're tuning in from, you're adding your voice to a community that believes in respect and in never forgetting those who've sacrificed. Because in the next few minutes, you're going to find out exactly why that young man would regret his words for the rest of his life, and how a quiet veteran changed an entire room without ever raising his voice. Daniel Harris had never been one for recognition. He didn't display his medals in a glass case or talk endlessly about the war. Most of the time, the only sign of his military service was the disciplined way he carried himself, even in a wheelchair, and the way his eyes scanned every room out of instinct. He'd served multiple tours overseas, survived an IED blast that had claimed both his legs, and lost friends whose names he could still recite without hesitation. Those medals on his chest weren't decorations to him. They were memories, painful ones. Each one represented a story that ended too soon, a sacrifice most people would never have to understand. Yet back home, life had become a different kind of battlefield. People didn't see the service. They saw the chair. They saw the disability before the man. And for Daniel, every interaction was a test of patience and grace. So when a young employee made his careless remark, Daniel's first instinct was not anger. It was disappointment. Not for himself, but for the fact that someone so young could fail to understand the weight of what those medals meant. In that moment, Daniel had a choice. He could let the insult pass and enjoy his coffee quietly. Or he could turn into a moment that everyone in that shop would remember. Daniel decided to act, not with confrontation, but with a story. He ordered his coffee and, instead of heading to his usual corner table, he stayed at the counter. "You see these medals?" he began, speaking loud enough for the surrounding customers to hear. "They're not mine. Not really. They belong to the men and women I served with. Some of them never made a home." The shop went quiet. Even the sound of the espresso machine seemed distant. The young employee shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. Daniel continued, telling them about a freezing night in Afghanistan when his unit had been ambushed. How Private Lewis, just 19 years old, had pulled him a cover after the blast, only to be hit himself. "He didn't make it," Daniel said softly, "and I've worn this medal for him ever since." He told them about Corporal Martinez, who had a newborn daughter he never got to meet. About Staff Sergeant Coleman, who used to joke that if anything happened to him, someone better make sure his dog got the best steak dinners money could buy. Daniel's voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of loss and loyalty. By the time he finished, the atmosphere in the shop had completely changed. Customers weren't just looking at a man in a wheelchair anymore. They were seeing the invisible army that stood behind him. The young employee's face was pale. I'm sorry," he managed to say. Daniel nodded once. "Don't be sorry for me. Just remember that some things you see, you can't measure with your eyes." The story didn't end there. The next day, Daniel returned to the coffee shop. This time, the young employee greeted him differently, with a respectful "Good morning, sir," and no trace of mockery. Over time, they began to talk. The young man asked questions about Daniel's service, and Daniel answered, carefully but honestly. It wasn't about making him feel guilty. It was about giving him perspective. Soon, the shop started doing something new. Once a month, veterans could get a free coffee. The idea came from that very employee who admitted that his grandfather had been a soldier, but he'd never really asked him about it. The change spread. Customers began to thank veterans when they saw them. Conversations replaced awkward silences. And all of it began with one moment of disrespect and the choice to answer it with dignity instead of anger. Halfway through this story, I want to hear from you again. Tell me in the comments, what's one lesson you've learned from someone older or more experienced than you? You might be surprised at how many people connect with your answer. Weeks passed, but the coffee shop incident became something of a local story. Not because it went viral, it never did, but because people in the neighborhood began noticing subtle changes. Veterans now lingered a little longer over their coffee, greeted by name. Customers gave a polite nod when they saw a uniform or a medal. It wasn't grand or publicized, but it mattered. One chilly afternoon, Daniel sat by the window, sipping tea. Outside, the young employee walked by and caught sight of him. Without hesitation, he stepped inside, nodded respectfully, and said, "Good to see you, sir." Daniel didn't need applause or headlines. That small gesture, that shift in understanding, it was enough. Because respect, once given, doesn't just honor the person wearing the medal. It honors every silent sacrifice behind it. As Daniel finished his tea, he looked down at the medals resting on his chest. They weren't decorations. They were reminders of battles fought, friends lost, and the promise to never let their memory fade. He knew there would always be people who didn't understand, who saw only medal and ribbon. But for those who took the time to listen, those who asked, the truth would always be more powerful than any insult. And to you, watching this story right now, remember this. We pass heroes every day without knowing it. Some carry their scars where you can see them. Others hide them deep inside. All deserve the respect we'd want for ourselves. If this story moved you, take a moment to leave a comment below, sharing where you're watching from. And if you know someone who's served, send them this video as a small gesture of gratitude. Hit the like button so more people can hear Daniel's story, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes the most powerful battles happen far away from the front lines.